place, rock the 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 place.
Welcome back to We Talk Audio. I'm your host Luca, and joining me today is no other than Stephen Kosters from AVL Media Group in Canada. Welcome to our second episode for this year. Stephen here has a lot of interesting stories heralding back from the late 70s and a good recollection of a lot of interesting stuff that has happened during the last 40 years of audio in his neck of the woods. So please, Stephen, can you introduce yourself a little bit better than what I just did?
So I'm Stephen Kosters. I've been in this business, in the audio business, probably 45, 46, 47 years. From Montreal, born in Montreal, and still working and having the company from Montreal. And, you know, audio has changed, obviously, you know, for anyone who's been in the audio business for any length of time. You know, the amount of how technology has changed is immense. When I had started, I mean, in those days we had columns, Shure Vocal Master columns, with a little mixer amp. That's going back, you know, 47, 48 years. And then things got into bigger speakers like Altec A7s, which was a, you know, huge box the size of a sub that had a 15-inch and a horn, and that was Altec Lansing. And people were renting that. And I remember the power amps at that time were Crown DC 300s. I think that was the one. And then also BGW 750s was another strong amp at the time. And I think it was an English brand of amplifier, H&H power amps. And I think at the time, amplifiers that gave you 400 watts in 4 ohms, 2-channel, was basically what was running systems at the time. And then when speakers became larger, we went into things like Martin Audio, where you had those Martin Audio large subs that had a 15, and then you had 2 of those per side, and then you had a 12 rounded. They used to call it a fill-a-shave. Yep. It was sort of like a razor with 12s. And then on the top there were horns. They were metal horns, JBL. I remember the model still. They were 2350 horns with, at the time, a 2440 driver, which was a 2-inch diaphragm, and then it went into a 2441 or 2445 when it went into neodymium. Mm-hmm. I do believe it was that. And that lasted quite a number of years. And when I had my rental company, basically we had only those kits. And actually they were copies. They weren't the original ones because I couldn't afford to buy the real Martin Audios. It was a lot more money. So there was a wood shop in Montreal that made copies for us, and we loaded them up with JBL 15-inch speakers. The 12s were loaded up all with JBL components. In those days, component sales were very, very strong. I remember JBL selling components, and people would make boxes. I think there's a very well-known rental company in Montreal that are now worldwide that you all probably know, called Solotech. And I remember at the time they had S4s or S2s, which was essentially JBL components front-loaded, you know, and I think Claire Brothers too had that for many years, which was basically a square box with all front-loaded speakers. So that was part of it. And I remember having cabinets that were community Leviathans, where they were these huge cabinets made out of not plastic, but not wood anyway. I guess plastic, but they were huge. They were rounded on the back, and you would load up speakers, and it was very difficult because horns wouldn't fit on them. Sure. So you'd have them on the side, and you'd have to, I don't know what they did at the time, build some kind of a rig or something, yeah, to put the. So that's how it was. And in those days, power amplifiers, we graduated from, as I said, from BGWs to that. And I remember the QSC emerged in those years, and we were renting the MX 1500, and that was a very, very popular amplifier in our rig. I think that's all we had at the time was QSC MX 1500s. Crest also too, they were in before that, but their amplifiers failed. I remember they had problems. The failure rate on those was quite high. So then we graduated to QSC, and then speakers at that point, then still for many years were at, you know, in terms of components and large cabinets. And then the line arrays came out, and that all started with, you know, line arrays and powered line arrays. So
And hanging stuff.
Which at the time, back in the 70s, you know, you wouldn't hang anything.
Yeah, no.
Right? But it was funny because in those days, lighting too was not a mature business at the time. And I remember coming to a lighting show in those days. The lighting shows were in Rimini, and I remember being in Rimini, where in all the Italian companies, because the disco time, all the clubs in Italy, they set the standard. And all the companies back then, Lampo, Sistemi Luce, Music and Light, Clay Packy, all those companies existed back then, and they did all the clubs, and people from all over the world would come to Italy and buy. They would have something crazy like, you know, a 42-inch mirror ball that would cost a fortune to ship it over because it's made out of styrofoam. It was nothing. So I remember people coming to all the clubs in Italy and trying to, you know, copy and build, you know, copy the format and build it in North America. And I remember at the time when there, you know, Chinese manufacturers at the time were not allowed to exhibit at the show, nor take pictures.
Yeah, of course.
In those days. And you see how over the years, how it's completely changed and whatever. But so that lighting business evolved. I remember the day when people would take paint cans and take the paint can and cut it and put in a, you know, the socket, and use gels in the front and use paint cans and how what they use for trussing. At the time, people would have antennas outside their house.
Oh my God.
So they would buy that antenna, not trussing. So they would use the antenna and use that and hang that. And many times in clubs, you would see basically that TV antenna that you would buy for your house to put up a satellite. Okay. They use that for trussing.
Nice.
Yeah. So, you know, at those times, you know, certification wasn't a factor. And I'm not talking the large professional show. I'm talking about the smaller, mid-sized rental companies.
And going back to the heydays of your career, I tried to do my homework, and I've read that you started when you were young, around 18, and that's
younger than that.
Even younger than that, knowing that. A lot of bands were emerging from the underground in Montreal, and that was a very exciting time to be involved in music. I can picture a young guy in Montreal just starting to acquire gear just to make those shows running. How did that came about?
Well, I started playing guitar when I was 12 years old, and I was in a band at 14 or 15 years old, and you know, did that being a teenager, you know, wanting to be popular and wanting to do, and in those days, you know, there were a lot of live venues that had entertainment, you know, all over North America, all over the world. That too has gone away, you know, substantially. But in those days, every kid was in a band. You know, everyone was in a band, practicing in a garage or practicing in their parents' basement, and that's what we were. And we formed the band, and we played clubs in Montreal, and I used to collect guitars, very vintage guitars. So I would buy, you know, old Fenders or old Gibsons, and I would collect them, and I would buy old amplifiers. And then I saw that a lot of bands, you know, didn't have equipment. You know, the equipment he had wasn't very good, couldn't afford. So what I did is I started renting musical instruments and amplifiers to the bands in the circuit that I was playing in. And so I started with that, and it started with musical instruments and buying, selling musical instruments. And I did that when I was 15, 16, 17, 18. And then went into business when I was 21. I had my first store when I was 21.
Okay, so musical instruments, but then you moved towards more.
Well, I had a retail store, and we were renting. But at the time, again, going back to audio,
Okay.
You would rent a Tapco mixer, and a Tapco mixer was turned into Mackie at that point, right? So little mixers at the time with power amps and speakers, very, very small speakers, or columns or whatever. So, and the microphones were still microphones that are used today, SM58s, SM57s, Sennheiser 421s to mic the drums, 57s for the snare, 58s for vocal. AKG came in for a while, they were popular. Audio-Technica came in for a while. So we did that, and then it developed into sound. As I said, at that period, we got into the Martin copies. We got into the modular systems. And then after lighting, DJ lighting became very, very, I would say that in the early 90s, then fog machines. I think Martin Lighting was one of the first companies to come out with cost-effective, moving heads. Scanners, I think. There weren't moving heads in those days. It was scanners. So you'd have a bulb with a mirror.
Yeah, and the mirror will move.
And the mirror would turn,
Yeah.
Reflective. And that was like mid-90s, I would say.
All right.
Yeah. And it's evolved since then. And now, well, of course, I mean, it's...
And just piggybacking from what you said earlier about Rimini and the lighting industry really driving the industry over here, I have spoken with a couple DJs from Italy. These are guys that have been active for the last 30 years, and back in the days they would tell me this exactly, and then they would tell me, but for the audio part we had to take the plane and go over the other side of the pond, because there were good Italian companies already building the systems, historical companies that you could find and still find in a lot of clubs. These old systems from the 70s still sounding. Not gonna say how, but they're still sounding.
Right.
There's still signal coming out of them.
Right.
And a lot of noise. What was important to them, and what was something that stood out to these guys, is the fact that these clubs like Paradise Garage, I know it's just across the border from you guys, so the sound was not so loud, but it was hugging. It was a good feeling, and it was something that you could not really get with a front-facing stack. It was much more pretty much surround before the age of surround, and then you had these tweeters strategically placed in these clusters in the middle of the room, and you could, and the DJ had the control over each single band. Right. And they could really tailor the song of the sound of that tune they were playing to the room and to the people, and they could melt people's brains pretty much from just twirling a knob. Well,
you had crossovers in those days. So you would have a crossover for the bass, mid, horns, and sometimes you'd have a tweeter. Yeah. And you'd have an amplifier for each section. So they would have one for the tweeter. And getting back, it was all JBL components. Okay. And people would, so even in clubs, a lot of those clubs, the equipment was basically custom made, but all the components were essentially JBL with the subs, 15 or 18s. So they would put it, on the floor, and they would build the box, to, if they had a stage, whatever the length was, and they would put the boxes with the speakers on the dance floor. So it'd be a lot of bass, and then the horns, the 12s, I don't know so much for 12s, but because I'm trying to remember, but it would be more horns and tweeters at that point. No, there were 12s, I'm sorry. But as you say, they were strategically placed. Like there would be a box with the tweeters, a box for the horn, a box for the mid-range. So everything, and that was hung, right? So depending on what they wanted. But everybody wanted like tweeters and bass.
Yeah,
right?
no mids.
No.
No mids.
That's why I was saying, I don't know if there were 12s. I don't know, it could have been just horn tweeters and subs.
Yeah, or just cut those.
Yeah.
All right. I bet in these years of career you had some interesting encounters, especially running sound in those effervescent times that you were living. So if you have some stories to share with us,
Sure.
it would
Well,
be cool.
Sure. I'll run through a couple of short stories, and I'll finish with one that's pretty cool. So we would get a call at the time. There was a company in Montreal called Audio Analysts, and now we're going back to stage gear. So it wasn't really sound; it was stage gear. And they were doing, at the time, there were bands in Montreal, Emerson, Lake and Palmer, and the other one was Chris de Burgh. And they were very, very popular in Montreal in the 70s. And I remember getting a call to deliver stage equipment. So we had delivered stage equipment to Emerson, Lake and Palmer and Chris de Burgh, practice equipment. I remember doing, jobs with some interesting people. We met, I forget her name because she passed away. She was one of the Supremes, and she was out singing. I'm not saying Florence Ballard, but the name escapes me. Anyway, we did a show for her, and she sang all the old Supreme songs in a nice. And I remember at the time using an Allen and Heath 12-channel 2-out console, doing that show in a theater, doing like an ex-Supreme, one of the singers in the Supremes, doing that. That was actually very nice because she was a very, very nice lady, and her son was her manager. And we did another thing that was really crazy is that we had a company in Montreal that had amusement park. What they had is amusement rides that they would load up, and they would go to different towns in Quebec. Anyway, they had a gig in Puerto Rico, and they needed sound for each of the rides. Guy with a microphone, 2 little speakers, and a power amp, right? And we supplied, I don't know how many of those. They must have had 30, 40 rides. So 30, 40 different systems, okay? It had no rhyme or reason. It was just an amalgamation of speakers, a power amp, and a mic, or 2 mics, and a little mix or whatever. Anyway, they go down there to Puerto Rico doing it, and I get my deposit, and I'm waiting for the balance of the money. Anyway, for some reason, their equipment gets seized by the government of Puerto Rico.
Puerto Rico, yeah.
Okay, and I don't know what they were doing, if they were not paying their taxes or whatever it was, because it was in those days a cash business. I don't know. Anyway. So what was funny is at the time, because I was just starting out, I'd given them all my sound equipment.
Yeah.
I mean, it was all little, so I had no insurance, nothing, right? And they were saying, I don't know, they might not return the equipment, right? So I was like freaking out. I remember that was very, very, looking back on it, was probably one of the most traumatic times, because I was going to be wiped out from not getting my equipment back. Anyway, they sorted it out with the government, and they were allowed to take their equipment back, and I got my equipment back. Anyway, so that was a pretty interesting story at the time. And the best story that we have is in the late 70s. I don't know if it was 79 or 80 or 81. I forget the date. But Bob Marley was performing in Montreal at the Montreal Forum, which was a shrine for it's like a hockey arena, and it was a hockey arena that basically our Montreal Canadiens had won a bunch of Stanley Cups, which is the
it's
highest
a sacred
level.
place, right?
It was like, that's why they called it a shrine. Anyway, we get a call from a company, Donald K. Donald, who was the main promoter in Montreal in those days. They did all the concerts in Montreal. So their team had called us to say that the backline truck for Bob Marley and the Wailers had broken down, and that if we could help them out, with a list of equipment. So the list was Ludwig. In those days, there wasn't a lot to choose from, and it was pretty standard. It was Ludwig drums, Fender twin reverb, 212 twin reverb, 100-watt amp. Keyboards was a Mini Moog, a Wurlitzer piano, a Hohner clavinet, a Fender Rhodes, and essentially that's what we had in our retail store. We had a rental facility and we had a retail store. So I went with my guy down to the store. We were closed, and we opened up the store and took stuff off the shelf, so to speak, loaded it up in the truck, delivered it to the forum. And of course, by then, you know, all the spectators, all the people were there waiting for Bob Marley. He was late. And it was a pretty cool experience to be, you know, I don't know, I was 24, 23 years old, setting up this stuff on stage at the forum, looking up and seeing 21,000 people. It was actually quite cool. Anyway, we set it all up, and basically we stayed backstage, and, you know, we listened to the concert, which was very, very cool. And at the end, we started taking down our equipment and load it up, and we're going to load it up in our truck, bring it back to the store. Anyway, the manager for the Wailers comes over and says, you know, the band want to thank you for helping them up and, you know, making this concert, you know, go ahead, you know, being successful. So we went backstage, and as we go into the room, as you can imagine, it was Bob Marley and the Wailers. I don't have to tell you, the fog was, you know, as thick as whatever, London fog, I don't know. Anyway, we were immediately past one large, you know, I don't even know if you could call it a it was just like huge, something rolled in newspaper or something like a, anyway, so we partook in that for a bit and met all the Wailers, and it was, for me, almost a religious, spiritual experience. It was amazing. They were great people, very, very calm, and
well, the message of reggae is one of peace and spirituality.
Right,
so.
right, and you could see that that whole room it wasn't, you know, sex, drugs, and rock and roll. It was very, you know, I thought it was very spiritual.
It is,
and it was it'll stay with me for the rest of my life. That was a great experience.
I can see it from the look in your eye.
Yeah.
So let's change pace a little bit here. In this season, we have this little game that we call the Spaghetti Challenge.
Okay.
It's an easy one because this is an AES3 cable. It's got some memory. I don't know how long it has been since you.
Then I wrap the cable.
Yeah.
I'll tell you the exact date.
Oh, wow.
Okay. Probably 1980. Wow. Probably late 80s.
I want to see this late 80s technique.
Okay,
So the timer is gonna start whenever.
Okay.
Whenever it's unraveled. Let's make it fair. Let's make it fair. I don't want to have you.
What's the late 80s? What does that make? Were you born then?
Yeah, I was actually.
Okay.
I was just about coming out my mom's stomach, actually.
Okay.
Didn't come out from the usual.
Okay, you're helping me out though. Normally I don't have this, you know.
Yeah, no, but I don't want tangles to happen and things like that.
You want me to make my life easier?
There you go.
When do I go?
Whenever you want. 3, 2, 1, and go. Oh, I see some text cringing here. I see him. I see his face over there. Hey, I'll allow it. Guy was sitting backstage with the Wailers.
Okay, here.
Awesome. Stop the time.
Okay.
Guys, this is where you can put your over under, you know. It's 16 seconds.
What was the winner?
I mean, Luma Narino, the guy uses cables every day, so
Yeah. So what was his number? I need to know.
11.
Oh.
Okay, it's not bad. It's
5 seconds. Come on.
It's not bad. It's not
Come
bad.
on.
It's not bad.
I mean,
see? It's not bad. We got.
Did I get a trophy? Here. Did I win a car? Something?
Yes. So, we'll see at the end of the year.
All right.
I mean, it's both about quality and time. So this is good quality and decent time. This goes to show that you can wrap your cables like this. I'm just looking at our tech back there.
He's laughing because obviously I've done it all wrong.
No, it's because they like their over-unders and they like to show off their technique.
Yeah. You know what? It's like cowboys back in the day with the lasso, right? You know.
That's it, Stephen. It's been a pleasure. Thanks a ton,
Thank
and
you. Thank you for having me.
and till next time.